I mean, Europe faces a long, very hard road ahead, I think, and Britain may be the hardest of all of them because it's isolated now, and we're already seeing some of the deindustrialization, closing of the auto plants by Honda, by BMW. I mean, these are big problems for Britain. I mean, Britain is under, I mean, as we say in the U.S., behind the eight ball. They've got a lot of problems facing them.
On today's episode of the What the Finance podcast, I have the pleasure of welcoming on Robert Bryce, who's an author, journalist, podcaster, film producer, and public speaker with over 30 years' experience. And I know you specialize in energy and electricity. So, Robert, thanks for joining the podcast today.
Happy to be with you, Anthony.
Yeah, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation because, a lot's happened over the past few months in energy, electricity. You could also say a lot hasn't happened, which people expected. But from your perspective, what are you currently seeing in the energy and electricity landscape in the US and I guess across the world as well?
Well, let's start across the world first. I think, what is interesting is Europe really dodged a bullet this winter, right? They didn't have the cold weather that they expected, and so they didn't have, what were predicted to be even mass casualty events, right? Because of cold weather. That didn't happen, luckily. Now, the question is what's going to happen next winter, of course, right? And with the ongoing Russia invasion of Ukraine and the lack of Russian gas into Europe, what is that going to mean? I think structurally higher prices in Europe for a long time. And so what's been the response? A lot of moves in Europe to embrace nuclear. We've seen that just in the last few days with both France and Britain announcing that they're going to greenlight new nuclear, which I think is very interesting, right? Because France had been really neglecting their nuclear fleet for years. Now they just approved the French Parliament or French legislature approved a $50 billion program that Macron was promoting to build 6 new reactors. That's really important. You're in London, a lot happening in the UK, of course, around small modular reactors in response to this, clearly a response to the gas crisis, nat gas crisis in the wake of the Russian invasion. But also, I think the things that are interesting to me lately are what has happened in the coal market, particularly in Asia, given the IEA's report that coal demand again in 2022 set yet another record. Not necessarily because of increased coal demand in China, but in other parts of Asia. So, all of this confirms what I call the iron law of electricity, which is people, businesses, and countries will do whatever they have to do to get the electricity they need. So, that's kind of the interesting things that I see in the electric market. It's not a global market. It's very much a regional and local business, but electricity demand continues to rise. And the U.S. continues to be, I think, in many ways isolated or insulated from a lot of these gyrations that are happening in the rest of the world. And it's because we produce so much of our own energy here.
And why is it such a regional sort of, I guess, industry?
Well, you don't ship electrons around the world. There are no super tankers for electricity, right? So, there are we move coal, we move dry coal in these bulk ships. We move oil, we move now LNG. Increasingly, we can move those molecules. And there's the old saw in the business, which is it's easier to move molecules than electrons. And so, electric grids are inherently local or regional entities, right? And they have to pay for themselves. And there are limits on how far you can economically move electricity. So, electric grids from the time of Edison have been really concentrated in local communities. Today in the U.S., a little quick background for some of your listeners, maybe we have over 2,000 publicly owned electric utilities in the United States and over 800, close to 900 electric cooperatives and another 180 or 150 investor-owned utilities. So in the U.S., we have 3,000 different electricity providers. I mean, it's a very diffused marketplace. So, but these entities tend to be regional and even local. And some cooperatives, well, I know one in Wyoming, they have something like 75 meters. I mean, they can be enormous, like Electricité de France, or they can be tiny. But they're almost always regional.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And as you said, I guess some forms of electricity are more efficient than others and easier to transport as others. So you could probably put coal in that position. It's easy to transport, whereas LNG is a lot harder because you need those terminals and the technology to actually be able to do that. So then I guess that makes it a bit challenging for certain countries that have specialized for certain types of molecules.
Well, sure, and what we've seen, one of the reasons why we've seen such a big increase in the price of coal, between 2020 and Late last year, the price went up 8x from $50 a ton to over 400. Now it's back down below 200 for the Newcastle marker. But coal is still an essential fuel for electricity production all over the world, including in the U.S. And even in the UK, you saw where you had a lot of cold weather, and some of the coal plants in the UK, they fired them back up again, right? They didn't shut them down. We see this in Germany, which supposedly has been a leader in terms of climate issues, but what are they doing? They're running their lignite plants flat out, and so the prospect of blackouts really clarifies thinking for a lot of people, and climate change, to use Roger Pilkey's line, it's the iron law of climate. When forced to choose between economic growth and action on climate, policymakers will choose economic growth every time. And so that's what we're seeing all over the world, I think, particularly in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I saw it in Japan when I was there last month. Energy realism. Climate change. Okay, yeah, we understand climate change, but we're going to make sure we have energy security first.
Yeah, if I'm not mistaken, Japan went very much towards gas and importing gas after the Fukushima crisis. So I guess from their perspective, when the when the gas price goes up so much, obviously their currency gets devalued as well. They're going to do whatever they can to find other avenues of actually getting those, the electricity they need, which was coal. And then is that sort of the same for all the other countries in that region, or were there other reasons that they maybe went towards that?
Well, I'll talk about Japan first. One of the things and I went to Fukushima Daiichi and saw the plant there, and the cleanup effort, which is going to take decades. And I also went to Japan Nuclear Fuel Limited and saw how the Japanese utilities are really placing a very long bet on the future of nuclear in Japan. So they've started 10 of their reactors after Fukushima Daiichi, and there's been a big push to open more reactors after Russia's invasion. Energy security was top of mind in all the meetings we went to. But they're also building new coal and new gas plants. In fact, TEPCO, Tokyo Electric, along with its partner Chubu and a consortium called JERA, they're building a 1.3 gigawatt coal plant in the middle of Tokyo. And so this is it's an ultra supercritical plant, right? Very high efficiency, but still they're building coal, and they're building about 5 gigawatts of new gas fired capacity as well, 7.3 gigawatts of new coal and gas together. So I wrote about this on my Substack, robertbryce.substack.com, in a piece called Japan No Kyoto, where I just point out that Japan, despite being the home of the Kyoto Protocol, they are being very clear about their energy needs, and they are prioritizing energy security over climate change, which, shouldn't surprise anyone. That's happening all over the world.
Yeah, and do you think this is something that's going to happen more? Because I guess, as you said, if we look at the last 10 years, people have probably been going away from, or trying to go away from coal, trying to go away from nuclear, going towards all the other green, less polluting fuels, as well as LNG. Do you see that maybe reversing, and a lot of more concern about, as you said, energy security and making sure that you actually have the electrons rather than just trying to be carbon neutral?
Well, we've seen that already, particularly in Pakistan. Just a few weeks ago, the Pakistani government essentially said, we're not going to buy LNG anymore. We're giving up on LNG. We're going to build coal plants. And so I think the Pakistanis are building something like 4 gigawatts of new coal-fired capacity. So again, another example of the iron law of electricity. So, this big increase in the price of LNG. Now, today I was just looking at the price. JKM marker, something like $13 per MMBTU. Compare that to Henry Hub, which is, of course, the U.S. marker. I think it was at $2.20. So roughly a 6x difference between the U.S. price and the JKM marker. But I think for a lot of Asian countries, they're looking at that, and they're looking at the price of nat gas, $13 per million. They can buy coal for what, $3, $4, $5 maybe, something like that. Maybe even less. They're going to say, well, we're going to use coal because it makes sense for them economically. And those supplies are not as constrained as the supplies for our LNG are. And they aren't as, there's the technology for coal-fired power plants is very well known. It's reliable. They don't have to have any special tankage, or they don't have to have pipes. They could store it out on the ground. So, coal has been remarkably durable. A lot of people don't like it, I understand. And we can talk about climate change. That's a concern for a lot of people. But when push comes to shove, the countries are saying, we're going to build and use the fuels that make sense for us.
Yeah, especially when they're struggling, with the price of all these things, that makes it a lot difficult, more difficult. So, if we look at the US, you mentioned there that it's quite, I guess, protected from all these issues because of the fact that it produces many of these resources and it can just rely on them themselves. So, it seems like the policy in the US has been very much maybe different to other countries. It's been not maybe not as strategic. It's been more, we have to push towards, green technologies. As you said, it's important, but then it's not really that realism that we're seeing in other parts of the world. If this continues, where do you think, I guess, electricity in these countries will go? What will happen in the US?
Well, I was talking with my friend Chris Kiefer for his podcast, the Decouple podcast, in fact, just this morning, and we were talking about nuclear in the U.S. And he put it this way, which I thought was a good way to summarize it. For the U.S., it's a nice to have, it's not a have to have. I've heard nuclear executives in the past say to build new nuclear in the U.S., they need natural gas prices to be at $8 per million BTUs, and they need another $8 or so on top of that in carbon taxes or something else. So they're talking $16. So they're essentially saying, to use today's prices, they need nat gas prices to be at or above JKM prices, right? They need to be high for them to justify new nuclear as compared to the price of natural gas. So the U.S. is different in that way compared to Europe, right? Where for European markets, I don't know what the TTF price is today. Maybe you know it off the top of your head, but I assume it's going to be somewhere close to JKM as a multiple of Henry Hub. So that's why we see Romania, Poland, Germany, other countries in Europe being more active on the nuclear front than the U.S. Now, there are a lot of companies in the U.S. that want to get licensed. They want to build new reactors, but there are a lot of constraints. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission being one of them, the fuel issues. The U.S. is not in that squeeze that is not facing the same price squeeze that Europe is, or the longer term issue of lack of supply. We've got producing a lot of natural gas in the U.S., and we set a new record for gas consumption in the U.S. just last year, over 88 billion cubic feet a day. So gas in the U.S. is plentiful and cheap, and that is going to put a brake on, I think, the development of new nuclear just for simple economic reasons.
Would there be policy changes, I guess, pushing investment away from gas? Do you see that happening, or is that not? Is it more oil and it's not really on the landscape for gas?
Well, I mean, there are, let's be clear, the Inflation Reduction Act is an enormous driver of the push for new solar and new wind, which compete directly with gas, right? And they're backing out gas. They're, in some cases, I think you could argue they're backing out coal, but they also hurt the economics of nuclear. So, by my calculations, the money that is now behind wind and solar between now and 2030, the total subsidies, and that's what they are. They call them tax credits, but they're subsidies. It's on the order of $240 billion. I mean, these are massive numbers. So for, companies that want to get into the electric generation business or are already in it right now, they're going to be chasing those subsidy dollars in wind and solar, I think, before they're going to chase gas and nuclear. Now, are some gas plants being built? Yes, there's no doubt. Are some nuclear plants going to be built? Yes, no doubt. But comparatively, the money is where, you follow the money, right? What is John Dillinger's old line? Why do you rob banks? That's where the money is. So
Yeah, definitely. So it sounds like there probably aren't going to be too many issues in the US. If we sort of go to Europe, and I guess, you mentioned that they got through the winter this year, there's potential risk that next year, even though they've built more infrastructure, it might not be enough, especially if it's colder. But what are you seeing will happen, maybe in winter next year, especially if Russia and Ukraine are still at war?
Well, I think it's going to be, this is going to put pressure on the LNG price. I'm just looking again. Maybe I quoted JKM when I was looking at TTF, but the TTF price right now is about $13, $12.96. Is that going to be the same as the JKM price? Let me just see. It's $13. So the TTF, which is the marker for LNG into the Dutch market or the gas trading hub in Holland, you're facing structurally higher gas prices. So we've already seen some of the deindustrialization of Europe. The closure of some of your fertilizer plants. Now, some of them have come back online, but heavy industry, particularly in Germany, a lot of that German industry is under major threat. And so some of those, BASF has already announced plant expansions in the U.S. They're going to expand in China. They're going to expand in markets where they see lower cost energy, both in the form of nat gas and oil, but also in the form of electricity. So I think that this, Europe faces a long, very hard road ahead, I think. And Britain may be the hardest of all of them because it's isolated now. And we're already seeing some of the deindustrialization, closing of the auto plants by Honda, by BMW. These are big problems for Britain. Britain is as we say in the U.S., behind the eight ball. They've got a lot of problems facing them.
Yeah, definitely. I guess, do you think this is a trend that's going to continue? Because if you look at the last 30 years, especially in mainland Europe, Germany, it's really been off the back of cheap energy, cheap gas from Russia. So do you see this something that's not going to be just an issue for next year, but it's potentially, as you said, it's almost like a structural shift where a lot of this manufacturing is going to move to the more energy, safe areas, and that's going to have a massive impact on these countries.
Well, yes. And that I think is one of the reasons why we're seeing this driver toward more nuclear. But yes, the Nord Stream pipeline's been blown up now, so this is going to constrain the flow of Russian molecules into the European market. And I think some of this is going to occur. I'm not, I'm a homer. Yes, I believe in the U.S. I'm long the U.S., but I think this is going to be one of the things that's going to continue to drive foreign direct investment in the U.S. We have the rule of law. We have a pretty good workforce. And we have cheap, abundant, reliable energy for the most part. And so that's going to attract industry. And we've already seen some of those announcements.
Yeah, I guess it will also potentially increase the price of gas, especially in the US, if there's going to be a little bit of an arbitrage there, where probably not to an effect that's detrimental to the US, but people are going to feel it.
I think they will, and now clearly not yet, because the price of Henry Hub today, as I said, I don't know what it was, $2.20, something like that. This is incredibly cheap, and that should that change? Well, yeah, it maybe should. It's now, well, I'm just looking at it. The front month price for April of 2023, it's now down to $2.09. That's dirt cheap, but by December of this year, we're looking at $3.70. So the forward strip is showing higher prices in the future, which, well, it should. But I think that it's clearly going to be the European countries competing for those LNG molecules, both from the U.S. and from other LNG producers. And they're going to be outbidding other customers, particularly in Asia. And that's what I already mentioned, Pakistan being one of the countries that's been effectively just outbid. The Germans said, "Oh, well, we're going to buy all that. We're going to store as much gas as we can, and damn the price. We'll pay whatever." And they've refilled, right? So, but is that going to be enough for winter of 2023-24? I can't say, but clearly we're seeing the globalization of the natural gas pricing. But we're also seeing the effect of those LNG exports. They're going to be felt by the American consumer, because now by the end of 2025, something like we're going to have 20 BCF a day of LNG export capacity. That's a big number, particularly when you consider we're consuming about 90 BCF a day. So up to a quarter of all the production in the U.S. could be headed to foreign markets. That's a big number.
Yeah. So do you see that, you mentioned that the prices are probably going to become more efficient. Do you see that happening, further into future, say 2025, 26? They're sort of going to almost converge on each other, the prices across the regions, because of this increase in investment in infrastructure? Or you don't think it'll get to that point?
I hate to say, across the board, because these prices are always going to be, they're going to be local, right? They're always determined by whatever that local trading hub is. So, what gas trades at Waha in West Texas is going to be different, or these other trading hubs, they're going to vary dramatically, and it's going to depend on weather and supply, of course, and all these other factors. But I think it's clear that after the Russia invasion of Ukraine, we're just facing a different energy landscape, and energy security is becoming much more of a concern, and I think trumping by no small margin the issue of climate. And that my 2 weeks in Japan really drove that point home, because in talking with people in Japanese government and industry, they're not talking about climate change. They're talking about energy security. And when I talked to in fact, he's a former, he works for TEPCO, Tokyo Electric, and I showed him the list of power plants that are being built, the coal and gas plants. He said, this is the reality in Japan today, that this is energy security matters to us more than any of these other issues have in the past.
Yeah. So do you think this will be sort of a stopgap until they can? Because I guess if you look at nuclear, it's going to take 5, 10 years plus potentially to get that capacity online. Do you think this will be the main stopgap between that? Just do whatever you can to have that security, and then hopefully within 10 years you can invest in the nuclear.
Well, and yeah, well, Japan made me much more sober. Let me just say that about nuclear, Anthony. I'm adamantly pro-nuclear and have been for a long time. But seeing the fuel supply chain issues that they have in Japan, the investments that they're making in fuel the nuclear fuel disposal, high level and low level disposal, they're investing $20 billion in their fuel supply chain. They're going to be able to cover effectively all of it except for the uranium itself, right? They're going to have to import that mined uranium or the ore or the enriched ore. And then they're going to do the reprocessing. They're going to do the enrichment. They're going to do the whole full meal deal. So that, that's the other key question now in the nuclear sector is from where will the U.S. how will they fill the gap left by the hole that Russia is leaving, right? Because a lot of these new technologies that are being proposed in the U.S., these small modular reactors, they need high assay, low enriched uranium, HALEU. Well, Russia is the only supplier of HALEU now for that market. And if Russia isn't available, Russian HALEU isn't available, where are the U.S. companies going to get it? And right now, there's no clear answer about that. So, these energy security issues they're not just about coal, oil, and natural gas. They're also very much about the future of nuclear energy. And there are a lot of question marks there. And I'm here in Austin. I had dinner with a friend of mine who works in the SMR business, and they have a very promising technology. I said, what are the key challenges ahead? He said, the NRC, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and fuel.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I guess you think that there's other places for uranium. I guess Kazakhstan I think is a big provider, but then also Australia. Is it just the actually then turning it into the fuel? Is that the challenge that is going to happen?
Well, it's both. It's the mining and the enrichment and the turning them into usable fuel, whether it's TRISO or HALEU or making the assemblies. All these things. This requires a robust supply chain. And the U.S. Has effectively, we haven't shuttered all of our uranium production, but most of it. And so we need to get back in the mining game. Well, that's not going to be popular with the Sierra Clubbers, right? And make no mistake, these NGOs, I don't call them environmental groups anymore. I don't call them green groups. They're NGOs. They're climate NGOs. They're focused on, effectively, in many cases, just one issue, and that's climate change. But they are also very concerned, they get very active when it comes to any kind of mining. And so the possibility that the U.S. will dramatically ramp up mining, not just for uranium, but for copper, nickel, all these other commodities, these other metals that are going to be needed for this much hyped energy transition. It's going to be very difficult to get these projects approved and online. And even if you can get a project approved, generally speaking, the rule of thumb is it's a decade from, getting that permit issued and to, actual production. Well, that's a long time and a very difficult timeline to finance if you're looking at a 10-year waiting time.
Yeah, especially with the uncertainty of interest rates at the moment. So we've mentioned Europe, and I guess they're really the big catalyst that's actually pushed the price of energy, especially to Asia, and you can say less to the extent to the US. Is that really the main red flag and the main concern that you have going forward in terms of, I guess, energy? Is there anything else that you're currently paying attention to?
Well, I mean, I guess the other big macro issue that I'm focused on, macro issues, I'm working on another documentary. So I've made one documentary. It's called Juice: How Electricity Explains the World. It's available. Unfortunately, it's not available in many of the international markets. It's available here in the U.S. And I've written 6 books, and I do my podcast, and I have my Substack, robertbryce.substack.com. But I'm really focused on the electricity markets, not just in the U.S., but globally. And the great disparity, I think the clear defining disparity in the world today is this vast gap between the electricity haves and the electricity have-nots. Right? So there are roughly 3 billion people in the world today who live in countries where per capita electricity use is less than what's consumed by an average American refrigerator. 1,000 kilowatt hours per capita, or 1,000 kilowatt hours per year is average kitchen refrigerator in the U.S. So you have this massive number of people, roughly 4 out of 10 people in the world, who are still living in electricity poverty. So that's the great challenge that we, and I'm going to use the papal we now, we face globally. How do we help bring these people out of the dark and into the light and into the modernity? Well, we can only do so much, right? These countries have to take it on themselves. It's going to require them to deal with corruption. It's going to require them to deal with a whole lot of other issues. So this is one of the biggest challenges I think that that is faced now all around the world. And will these countries build coal plants, or could they skip coal and move to nuclear? Is that possible? Can we leapfrog one set of technologies, or are they going to use gas? I think gas is, and particularly in Africa, is going to be a key fuel for electrification because of the enormous discoveries of gas that have been discovered over the last few years offshore Tanzania, Senegal. I'm sure you're familiar with these. I mean, just massive, massive deposits of gas. So there are a lot of things that are very positive, and I am optimistic about the future. But we also face a whole bunch of challenges, and they are challenges really about scale. It's always, scale is always difficult, but the scaling up of the amount of electrification that is going to be required to bring all those 3 billion people into something close to modernity, it's a massive, massive challenge.
Yeah, I guess you say it's the same issue with I guess consumerism, and if these countries become consumers, how is that going to, what effect will that have on, I guess, our lifestyle and how much we're actually paying for things? And you could say it's the same thing for energy, which is even more important for everyday life. So it's going to be one of those things where everyone's probably going to have to pay more, and then a lot of people aren't going to be happy about that.
Well, such is the way of life, but we are an increasingly globalized world. And now, are we going to see some of that change after Russia's invasion of Ukraine? Yes, and also increasing conflict or potential conflict with China. I think there is a big effort afoot to do more reshoring, particularly here in the U.S., around pharmaceuticals, around mining, around industrial commodities. But these are also some of the key challenges, because a lot of this alt energy discussion, right? And I don't call them green technologies. I don't call them clean tech. They're alternative energy technologies. Their supply chains go through China, right? So whether it's neodymium iron boron magnets that you need for EVs, or whether it's polysilicon for solar panels, or wind turbines themselves, China dominates these markets, and China is dominating the markets for other critical metals, copper, nickel, these other things, and of course rare earth elements. Neodymium obviously is a rare earth. So these are all challenges that involve these global supply chains that we have taken for granted for years, and now they're suddenly coming into focus. And a lot of policymakers and I think analysts like me, I'm not saying I'm the only one seeing this, are just saying, "Ooh, this could be a real problem. And what are we going to do about it?" And that's the key challenge. Well, how did the U.S., the Western allies, Australia, I know you're an Aussie, and the Brits, how do they respond? And can the U.S. and its allies be responsive in a coordinated way that makes sense and maintain that over a multi-year or even multi-decade period? These are big challenges.
Yeah, and I guess you could say that the people who probably will benefit from that are, you could say Canada, US, and Australia. They're really the three, potentially Brazil. They're the countries that have this lots of energy that, the rest of the world really needs, especially maybe if we see that bifurcation between two sides.
Well, I'd add Mexico, and
Yep.
Peter Zion makes some good points about Mexico. That this reshoring, the deglobalization, as he's called, I don't know if that's his word, but this trend that I've been talking about, that's one of the issues that he says, is that this is going to be another solidification of the U.S.-Mexico relationship and the NAFTA North American trade, because Mexico has an abundant source of labor. They're relatively stable, relatively good on the rule of law. All of these things, and they're close to the U.S. So a lot of that supply, that outsourcing and offshoring into places like China and elsewhere, some of that's going to come to the U.S. and some of it's going to go to Mexico, and that will then, Mexico will continue to grow in its importance. This is Zion's theory, and I think he's right. It's going to continue to grow in importance to both the U.S. and to Canada.
Yeah, definitely. That makes a lot of sense. So, Robert, thanks again for your time today. I really appreciate it. I guess my last question is, what is one message you'd like people to take away from our conversation?
Well, first sign up for my Substack, robertbryce.substack.com. Um, I think, well, a couple things, I guess. You caught me a little flat footed there, I think. But one, I'm hopeful. And, we live in an incredible time. And we are incredibly fortunate to live in the times that we are. I mean, it's just an amazing time to be a human. And so I'm so grateful for that. And I try and keep that gratitude right in the forefront. Second, I think if I know you talk a lot about finance, but if you're interested around the energy issues and and finance and money issues, take the time to dig deep into the energy and power businesses and understand the units in particular. That would be my encouragement as well. As the BP Statistical Review started publishing their data in exajoules. They started publishing in SI units, which thank goodness, But I'll tell you, I go into meetings with full of energy company executives, and I talk about exajoules, and I ask them to raise their hand. Do you know what an exajoule is? Not a single stinking hand. I'm like, wait a minute, you guys are in the business. You need to know this. So it's important that if you care about these issues, to know these basic units of energy and power and understand the units and understand how to convert them, because they are key to understanding the scale, both the scale and the importance of the business. So, yeah, those would be my thoughts. Thank you.
Yeah, no, great messages to take away. So, yep, Robert, thanks again for your time. So, you've mentioned your Substack, and we've mentioned your podcast as well, the Power Hungry podcast. Very good. Is there anywhere else that people can sort of find your work, what you do?
Oh, I'm. You can't miss me on the Google, Anthony. I'm on Twitter at Power Hungry, PWR Hungry. I'm on YouTube. I have my channel there. I post all my podcasts, the Power Hungry podcast on YouTube. I have my own website, robertbryce.com. So I'm the king of all media, as I like to think of myself. But I give shout out to my daughter, Mary Bryce. She's been helping me with all of this, and she's been great to. I think she coordinated this interview. So that's been great to work with her. Oh, and I'm on TikTok. You got to be on TikTok. So I'm on multiple channels. You can't escape me.
Yeah, wow. Sounds like you work out hard, but yeah, she's doing a great job. So, Robert, thanks again.
Thanks a million, Anthony. It's great fun.
Thank you so much for listening. And if you enjoyed the episode, please subscribe and click the bell icon so you are notified when new podcasts are released. I hope you're leaving with some great value about investing, trading, and finance. See you on the next show.